Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. If you're on Zoom, King's is a small Catholic liberal arts college sponsored by the Congregation of Holy Cross. It's in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is more or less in the northeast corner of the state. This event is our 10th annual Bessette Lecture on medical ethics, named after Saint Brother Andre Bessette, the first member of the Congregation of Holy Cross to be canonized as a saint. Brother Andre lived 1845 to 1937 in Quebec, where he became renowned as a healer.
Oh, wait. So is his heart in the...
It's in the basilica.
Oh.
That's right. We've done this 10 times, 10th Bessette Lecture. This is probably our most controversial topic. That's my bet. Part of the reason, though, to have an ethics center is to discuss in a public forum controversial topics thoroughly and carefully. So that's what we're going to do this evening. Special thanks to our two presenters. Dr. Dena S. Davis holds the endowed presidential chair in health at Lehigh University. She's been a visiting scholar at the National Institutes of Health, Arizona State University, the Brochet Foundation, and the Hastings Center. And she's been a Fulbright scholar in India, Indonesia, Israel, Italy, and Sweden, which is really quite enviable. So that sounds great. Her most recent book is Genetic Dilemmas, Reproductive Technology, Parental Choices, and Children's Futures, published by Oxford University Press. She's also the editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Religious Perspective on Reproductive Ethics. Dr. Davis has been a member of the Committee on Bioethics of the American Academy of Pediatrics and served on the boards of the American Academy of Religion and the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities. She currently serves on the MyCode Ethics Advisory Council in the Geisinger Health System, which is how we came to know one another, and the Central Institutional Review Board of the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Joshua Schulz is an associate professor of philosophy at DeSales University, where he has taught since 2009. He writes on normative and applied ethics in the Neo-Aristotelian tradition, publishing on such topics as abortion, human enhancement, hypocrisy and religious belief, and the ethical limits of AI. Dr. Schulz is also co-chair of the Ethics Committee at the Lehigh Valley Health Network, where he works part-time as a clinical ethics consultant. And I want to note, too, that he played an important role in helping to organize our fall 2022 conference, which we just held on health, hope, and despair, which was co-sponsored by King's and the Lehigh Valley Health Network. So for nuts and bolts, Dr. Davis will speak for around 35 minutes. Dr. Schulz will give a response to times at about 17 minutes or so. Finally, we'll turn to Q&A, and we'll go until about 15, so 75 minutes. If you're joining us through Zoom, please ask your questions through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your page. With apologies to our Zoom participants, can't make promises that your questions will make it into the mix. We'll do our best. So thank you again, everybody, for being here in the room and on Zoom, and please join me in thanking our presenters.
So actually, before I get started for real, I lived in Montreal for 4 years, 1972 to 1976, which was a time of enormous political and cultural upheaval in Montreal, including something called the Quiet Revolution. And a lot of that had to do with secularization and a rebellion against the hegemony of the Catholic Church in the province of Quebec. And Brother Andre, I'm ashamed that I never knew who he was, but his heart was, and I hope is now back in the oratorio in Montreal, and he was kidnapped and held for ransom. for quite a while. This was, on the front page of many newspapers. And there was also a rock group called the Heart of Brother Andre, which I'm sure is long gone. But anyway, there we are. So thank you very much for coming out on a cold night. Thank you very much for inviting me on this 10th anniversary. And I'd like to start with a quick thought experiment to the people in the room and also the people on Zoom. I'm going to tell you very quickly about 3 people. And then I'd like you to think and, if you don't mind, tell me which of those 3 people you would most want your life to go like. So all 3 of these people were diagnosed with Alzheimer's when they were 85. Does anyone have like a grandmother or grandfather? Maybe you know somebody with Alzheimer's. It's extremely common. So all of these people were diagnosed at a very early stage of Alzheimer's. And at that point, really, they were doing well, but they were, maybe walking out the front door, forgetting to shut it, having maybe a little trouble balancing their checkbook and whatever, but they were basically doing okay. And the first person, we'll call her Alice, had a heart attack and died within a few months of that diagnosis. The second person, we'll call him Bill, lived for another 5 years after that diagnosis. And he was still living independently, but really that was getting increasingly difficult. He couldn't drive, couldn't manage his finances, couldn't really, get 3 decent meals a day in terms of shopping, cooking, and planning. Often confused about what he was doing, and having some personality changes as well. And it was getting to the point where it was pretty clear that within the next year, he would really have to go to some kind of memory center, nursing home, or whatever. And at that point, at age 90, he had a fatal heart attack. The final person I'll call Charles, and Charles lived 10 years after getting that first diagnosis. So he lived till he was 95. And when he finally died, he was no longer communicative. He was no longer mobile. He was living in a very nice care center, very pleasant people. He didn't seem to be in any distress. He occasionally smiled, like chocolate pudding, whatever. But he did not recognize anybody, did not communicate, and spend his time either in a wheelchair or in a bed. And then at 95, he died as well. So those are the 3 people, Alice, Bill, and Charles. Hopefully people on Zoom, we actually have a poll going. So hopefully you actually can register your response, but I'd like to ask the people in the room, how many of you would want to be like Alice? Yeah, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe half of you or something. How many of you would like to be our second person, Bill? Okay. Who would want to be Charles? I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, so I'm not surprised by these results. This is a little more, I think this may have something to do with your age. I don't know, but sometimes it's more like 2/3 for Alice and 1/3 for Bill. And sometimes one person, partially to jerk my chain, will want to be Charles. But about half the people in this room, and are we getting any responses on Zoom? Do you see anything worth reporting yet? Okay, so more Charleses than we've seen here, but over 50% would want to have a heart attack within a few months of getting a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And it seems like 50% of you more or less would want the same. And somewhere between 0 here and 12% or whatever in Zoom, where we have, I don't know, a couple of hundred people, would actually say, would actually want to live as long as possible, despite the changes in their conditions. So I'm not surprised by this because I've been asking this question to groups for a number of years and getting responses that are kind of like this. But of course, you can't publish this kind of anecdotal information. So I finally decided, okay, I'm going to have to do a survey and get something that I can actually write and get published and then refer to. So with my research partner, Lauren Donnelly from Bryn Mawr, we asked 525 Americans over age 50, something like this. We made it a little more nuanced because they're reading the survey and have to remember it. So we had 4 stages and we presented them as little vignettes, little 1-paragraph descriptions of their lives. And this is what we got as a response. 56% would prefer to have had a heart attack at the earliest stage, kind of like you guys. 20% chose the second stage while still living at home, but unable to drive and exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. 11% chose the third stage when our protagonist was incontinent and living in a nice memory care center. We said, for example, she no longer recognizes her family, but she seems to enjoy their frequent visits. And finally, 12.5%, which is almost like what we just heard, preferred to die while in the final stage. Gender didn't make a difference, and neither did having a friend or family member who had had dementia. I'm embarrassed to say we didn't ask about religion, but we're doing a new survey, so stay tuned. The point is, over half of these Americans would prefer to have had a heart attack very soon after getting their diagnosis, and 3/4 of Americans would rather have a fatal heart attack than get to the stage where they would be unable to live independently. So what would our world look like if we were willing to accept that, respect that, and take it seriously? So I want to give you 3 examples that are almost at random. First, as Bernard said, I'm on the Institutional Review Board, which is like an ethics panel at NIH. We look at cancer studies. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is, what about people who lack decisional capacity? Meaning they're at some stage of dementia, can't say, yeah, I want to be part of this study, or at least they can't say it with full knowledge. But usually they have family members who can make those decisions for them. Should those people be allowed to be in research studies where there's some risk, we don't know the benefit, and so on? And we have a lot of discussions about this. And a lot of the doctors who are arguing for allowing them to join will say, well, we shouldn't deny them the possible benefit of a longer life. But if our survey is right, it seems that for the majority of people who lack capacity, longer life is not something they want. Right? But when secondly, you all remember when the available and there was all this, discussion about who should be in the first groups, right? And we discovered, for reasons that are still not clear, that people with dementia are more likely to die of COVID over and above being elderly and over and above living communally. There's something about dementia which is an independent risk. Everybody responded by saying, oh, get those people vaccinated. But it seems that being in a nursing home with dementia is what 3/4 of people don't want. They would rather have a heart attack. In fact, there are a number of studies that show that a large proportion of people consider being in a nursing home, requiring constant care, and or having dementia being a stage worse than death. Of course, those are people who are not yet in that state, right? Themselves into it, and that raises problems. Is anyone here med? Yeah, couple. You know who William Osler is? Oh, Ostler. So he was like considered the father of modern medicine. I'm not quite sure why. And he's said to have coined the phrase, pneumonia is the old man's friend. Well, what did he mean by that? He meant that pneumonia was a relatively, when somebody was quite old, and it would kind of take them of aggressive medical treatment, and they would just die. But we don't allow that anymore, right? If you have pneumonia, you get a ventilator and you get antibiotics and so on. So maybe COVID is now the old man or old person's friend. And maybe we should not be so quick to assume that we want to vaccinate those people first. I realize there are also problems about vaccinating, safeguard their caregivers and so on. Third, I've been reading about recent developments, drugs that claim to slow down Alzheimer's disease, a whole ruckus with the FDA and so on. And it looks like the second drug, lecanemab, whose brand name is Leqembi, may actually have some small degree of efficacy, but it has some real concerns, including a very high percent of people who get some sort of brain swelling, most of it asymptomatic. And according, even more concerning are 3 patient deaths linked to Leqembi that have prompted warnings from experts to limit access to the drug for certain patients. But again, not even the slightest acknowledgement that for people already in the first stages of dementia, death is not necessarily a fate to be avoided. To quote my software developer son, death might be a feature rather than a bug. In other words, going back to our survey, a majority of people should logically be more willing to sign up for a dementia drug with a risk of death than for one that has no risk of death. I understand this feels weird, it feels counterintuitive, but it follows with some degree of logic from what we've just experienced here in our group here. So I certainly acknowledge that hoping that if I get dementia, I hope I get a heart attack, is different from taking steps to help that to happen. And we could identify 3 different categories, maybe. The first would be passively hoping for a quick death from some outside force, like a heart attack or a lightning strike. The second might be an advance directive telling one's family that if one is at a certain stage of dementia, the family should refuse life-preserving interventions such as antibiotics for pneumonia. A third stage might be that not everyone with dementia gets pneumonia or some other life-threatening disease, and there may be nothing for the family to refuse. One could take one's destiny in one's own hands and end one's life. And I've seen papers that Bernard could share with you making the argument for that. So in our second survey, we tried to get at this second category, not positively trying to end one's life, but refusing possibly life-saving interventions. And it was much harder to write the survey because there were all these ifs, whens, coulds, maybes. But we told a story about Mrs. Waverly, a 75-year-old woman who's experiencing the first stages of dementia. She's trying to look ahead and give her family directions about her future care, should she no longer be competent to make her own decisions. She imagines that at some stage in her life, she gets pneumonia. She or her family must decide whether or not to treat it. And we tried to make this fairly black and white. If she does take antibiotics, she'll almost certainly live for about another 10 years. If she doesn't take antibiotics, she will almost certainly die. So we were cleaning up, simplifying the real world. So right now, Mrs. Waverly can choose. In the future, because of her increasing dementia, she may not be able to use. And we asked people to imagine that they were Mrs. Waverly. And we gave them the same 4 stages. And we asked them what decision they would make about antibiotics if it were her. And we asked 500 Americans over 50. And the answers were really kind of surprising. So if you remember, in the first survey, 56% of people would want to die in the first stage, and I forget what, 20 or something percent, and yeah, 20% the second stage, and so on. Here, only 20% would refuse antibiotics at the first stage, as opposed to 56 wanting the heart attack. That's really interesting. 35% would refuse it at stage 2. So already, the majority of people wanting to refuse antibiotics before they had to before they had to enter a nursing home, and so on. We wondered why. I mean, the results aren't crazily different, but they're substantially different. Why? And we don't know. We thought maybe comparing a heart attack to death by pneumonia was a mistake on our part. Difference, which wasn't really what we wanted to get at. Is it the refusal taking responsibility, whereas a heart attack just comes out of the blue and you're not responsible? Is it because the idea of an advance directive involves other people, someone else, like a family member, has to get in there and make that decision, or at least implement your decision? So we're doing a new survey to try to sort out those variables. But it's still the case that the majority of Americans over 50 would want their families to refuse antibiotics on their behalf before they could no longer live at home. However, as I discovered with my own mother, an advance directive is only helpful if there's something to refuse. So in this country, you can say no to antibiotics, no to a pacemaker, no to anything really, but you can't say, put a pillow over my head, right? So what if you don't get pneumonia? What if you don't need a pacemaker? My mother lived with her dementia for over 10 years, and I would have refused anything on her behalf, but she never got sick physically. Given my mother's values, she would have been better off had she ended her life. Well, she still had the wherewithal to do so, but she didn't. So advance directives face other challenges as well, which is why I believe they are virtually useless when it comes to dementia. Like a lot of other end-of-life strategies, these directives were largely created to help people facing death with cancer. So in the interest of time, I'm going to touch on these challenges very briefly. One important issue is the problem of whether or not to respect what we call precedent autonomy. So if I, right now, in my right mind, you probably figured out I'm kind of an autonomy freak and I really care about independence and all those things. So I write an advance directive, which I've done, and it reflects my values. But when I become demented, do I still have those values? Maybe not. Maybe I don't care about autonomy. Maybe I care about, I don't know, chocolate pudding and petting the dog in the nursing home and nice staff and so on. Maybe I'm perfectly happy being demented. And then I get pneumonia. Well, what do you do then? Do you respect the Dena Davis who wrote that advance directive? Some people would want to argue yes, but a lot of pretty important people have argued no. They've said, wait a minute. Wrote that a directive, she no longer exists. It's in her best interest. Sure, if she were miserable, distressed, sure. But if she's happy and enjoying her life, it's interest to end her life if she could easily be rescued from pneumonia. Rebecca Dresser and many other people have made that argument. So there's that philosophical problem, and I have to admit, I don't have a really good argument about it. It seems odd to me, this is Steinbeck's argument, that would be treating me as if I were someone who'd never had an opinion about these things, maybe somebody who'd been born intellectually disabled or something. It just erases the person I'd been for most of my life. And there's another problem as well, which is the problem of moral distress. Moral distress is a concept that was actually first identified among nurses in, I think, 1983. Some of you are nodding. Moral distress happens when you feel a moral imperative to act in a certain way, particularly in terms of your profession, but something else, maybe finances or the law or something else, is making it impossible for you to do that. So you can imagine a caregiver who has only known this demented person who smiles at her, pets her hand, pats her hand, seems pleasant and happy. And she never knew that first person. And now she's being asked not to give antibiotics for pneumonia. And she's a nurse, a physician. That can cause a great deal of moral stress. So it's not clear to me that you can trust your advance directive work. I mean, you, after all, are not kind of there anymore. And are you willing to trust that? So I don't think so. So that brings us, but I have not been looking at what. How many minutes? Okay, brings us to our third and final category, which is preemptive suicide. So in 1999, I wrote an article arguing that genetic testing for dementing diseases such as Huntington and Alzheimer could be an appropriate piece of a plan by people who believe that rational suicide is the right response to them to a finding of probable future dementia. But barriers to such a plan were huge. Now, some decades later, many of these barriers are crumbling. First, you no longer need to rely on health professionals to order and interpret relevant tests. Probably some of you have done 23andMe or something like that already. They're getting cheaper every day. People give them as Christmas presents. So you don't have to explain to your doctor why you're interested or get into a philosophical argument over the meaning of life and blah, blah. You just order a test and you get the results directly. Even non-genetic tests like PET scans can be ordered by individuals who are willing and able to pay out of pocket. Second, it's now becoming increasingly possible to diagnose Alzheimer's through clinical tests, which can give more specificity to the genetic blueprint and also track disease progression even before symptoms are manifest. So we're seeing an explosion of research. This is where 90% of the research energy and dollars are. An explosion of research looking for ways to diagnose dementia pre-symptomatically, before you are demented. So Jason Karlowesh, a physician at the Penn Memory Center, predicted, quote, "Someday you will not have to be demented to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease," close quote. And that day has come. And even the FDA now officially accepts first stage of Alzheimer's is pre-symptomatic. So you can order a drug for somebody who, maybe it's me, maybe it's you, who doesn't look, has no symptoms whatsoever because they have the underlying disease. Why is so much research around this? First, an early warning system could help with individual long-range planning. Nobody says, and they could end their life because they're too coy to say that, but you could write an advance directive or get long-term care insurance or whatever it might be. Second, finding the disease at the earliest possible stage can identify appropriate patients for therapies that could slow the course of the disease. Because there's one thing we know about Alzheimer's, which is if we're ever going to cure or slow it down or have an effect, we've got to start early, because the disease has started 10, 20 years before you show your very, very first symptom. The earlier you can find the disease, the better chance you have of attacking him. And I think everybody agrees on that. Third, pre-symptomatic diagnosis is a crucial building block in the research that seeks to find and test these very therapies. For one thing, your drug company, think about, how do you test a drug? What, 10,000 people, and you give one half the drug and the other half a placebo, and you hang around for 20 years and see what happens. Eventually viable, right? But if you can identify which people are already really at high risk and have that enriched, population, then you can get somewhere, right? Then you can really say, oh, if you got a high risk, works, then we'll really see some effectiveness here. So drug companies are spending a great deal of time trying to look for what they call biomarkers. So this pre-symptomatic testing runs a gamut. Imaging to track volume loss and cerebral blood flow, concentrations of amyloid beta in the cerebral spinal fluid, a molecular test based on plasma signaling proteins, various types of blood tests, non-invasive tests of episodic memory, self and informant reports of cognitive status. Modalities can range from invasive, unpleasant, and expensive, like a spinal puncture, to a simple pen and paper test. Other possibilities include motion sensors and smart carpets that monitor gait and mobility for early signs of cognitive decline. So these monitoring systems, and given that the time people in America are 85, half of them have dementia. So boy, if somebody asked you to buy stock in a company that could monitor that with a simple carpet, that would probably, in my opinion, I'd probably buy stock in that. So all these monitoring systems supposedly help people to age successfully at home, with the results being transmitted to watchful family members or clinics. But there's no reason a savvy and determined person could not make use of these, direct information only to herself. Now, critics may argue, and do argue, that these various tests should not be available to the public until they are completely predictive, if they ever are. Or perhaps far into the future, neither the genetic risk predictors nor the various pre-symptomatic tests are 100% informative. Nonetheless, when one has a variety of genetic and clinical tests, each with a substantial freight of information, one can layer them to come closer to certainty. How close one needs to be in order to act is obviously a matter of individual values. How do each of us as individuals weigh the value of living maybe 4 more years of life as an elderly and quite possibly demented person against the value of not becoming demented because one ends one's life now? That's, an individual weighing. But people have been making these kinds of judgments for a really long time. Cancer patients balance the possible benefits of various therapies, many of them nasty and experimental, against their serious side effects, including the risk of cardiac damage and second cancers in later life. Women who carry the BRCA mutation are urged to consider bilateral mastectomies, despite the fact that BRCA is not 100% penetrant. So you can have BRCA and not necessarily ever get breast cancer. And the mastectomy does not guarantee they will not get breast cancer anyway. This is no different. People must weigh the risks of shortening their lives unnecessarily against the risks of developing Alzheimer's disease. The risks are, by their very definition, uncertain. That's what we mean by risk. But that should not bar people who wish to do so from getting all the information available and acting on their own values. So thank you very much.
Can you hear me okay? Working? Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua. Allow me to thank Professor Davis for her careful and lucid defense of rational suicide, and Professor Beck for inviting me to respond. All the views that I'm expressing my own. And let me say also that I didn't get a copy of your responses more general than specific, and hopefully I'll touch on a number of different issues that we can perhaps raise in discussion afterwards. So, one traditional account of why suicide is irrational, even in the case of impending dementia, begins with the fact that the human person is the living God, the always created state of God's redemptive activity, capacitated for grace from the first moment of her existence and destined for eternal beatitude. And as participants in the sacramental life of the universal church, our bodies are tabernacles whose doors or lips are stained with the blood of Christ, whose blood preserves us from spiritual death and sin, just as the blood on their doorposts once preserved Israel from physical death, visited by God's terrible judgment upon the firstborn. Invite death into the tabernacle of our body through those same lips. God has redeemed and made holy by claiming it as his own. Now, right now, polite audience members might be thinking, well, I'm not Christian, so how would that apply to me? Well, there's a brief answer to that question. Don't be afraid. Christ died to save you too. Don't be unbelieving, but believe. More expressive people might be thinking that bringing theology into a philosophical debate is like bringing a banana to a gunfight. You thought we were going to be trading argument, not broader a few just so stories for the superstitious and the weak-minded. Maybe. However, starting our discussion by acknowledging the theological elephant in the room in what we mean by rational in the phrase rational suicide. Tonight, what I'd like to do is to give a brief 6-point argument against rational suicide and articulate 2 practical concerns for further discussion. So the first point is that Max Weber famously distinguished between 2 different kinds of rationality, instrumental and substantive. Picture the differences between 2 traditions of thinking about the meaning and value of human life. Instrumental rationality refers to the effectiveness and efficiency with which desire, preference, or goal that we happen to have. So if I wonder whether I should cruise, fly, or roller skate from New York to London, it's instrumentally irrational to choose roller skates, and whether it's more rational to choose flying over cruising will depend on my preferences or goals. Do I need to get to London quickly for a meeting, or would I prefer a relaxing week at sea? Substantial rationality refers to the accuracy or fittingness with which I grasp and respond to various, whether I should kiss a stranger on the cheek or them, or cover my heart to the national anthem at a baseball game, then I'm deliberating using substantial rationality. I'm considering the appropriateness of my response to things and people that arguably have value independently of and prior to my interactions with them. How I respond to them is a judgment upon me, not a judgment of their worth by me. So both modes of thinking are forms of rationality, precisely because they begin with the grasp of the truth of something, the truth about what kind of value something has. It is in light of my grasp of the truth that airplanes will get me to London faster than roller skates, that I judge flying to be preferable to skating. It is in light of my grasp of truth that my wife has a lovely soul, that I love her. Now, one of my favorite illustrations of the difference between instrumental and substantial rationality occurs in Shakespeare's Hamlet. In Act 2, a troupe of actors perform a scene in which Priam's wife Hecuba watches as he is violently killed during the sack of Troy. An event, the actor says, unless things more move them not at all, would have made milch the burning eyes of heaven and passion in the gods. When the bureaucrat Polonius interrupts to complain about the length of the speech, a judgment of its instrumental value, Prince Hamlet turns to him and says, "It shall be to the barbers with your beard." The beard Polonius is unworthy of is a conventional sign of experience and wisdom, and Polonius's inability to recognize recognize the pathos of a loss that could move gods to tears is a symptom of his underlying substantial irrationality. It's a sign of his moral blindness. But blindness to what? My second point is that we grasp something's intrinsic value and exercise in substantial rationality by grasping meaning, that is, its participation in a larger context or narrative. So suppose I wake up and find my friend Rodney running across my front yard in a hot pink tracksuit. Maybe he's exercising, I wonder. He's a theologian, they're kind of crazy, maybe that's how they do it. Then I notice the number on his chest. I realize he's running a race, maybe a whole 5K. Then I see that he's being chased by a group of men, which means he's winning the race. Then I also notice that he's carrying the trophy and the men are angry. And I realize he's not winning, he stole the trophy and they want it back. Now, the semiotic point here is simple. We understand Rodney's running through its participation in a narrative about trophies and races. Rodney's running is not just a movement of his limbs, and the meaning and value of his action isn't just determined by Rodney's beliefs, even if his beliefs are part of the larger narrative in which he's stolen a trophy. The larger narrative illuminates the meaning of Rodney's running. My third point is simply that it's wrong to treat something with intrinsic value as if it's merely useful. If you've ever complained that your bosses treat you like a cog in an economic machine, or if you were offended when climate vandals threw tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers, you were giving voice to the wrongness, what we sometimes call basement, the sacrilege, the indignity, the disrespect of treating someone or something with intrinsic value as if it were merely useful. And I think this participative account of value is more familiar than foreign. We recognize, for example, that things which would otherwise have purely instrumental value can acquire a kind of intrinsic value through their participation in a larger narrative. For instance, things can gain historical value because of their role in the story of humanity. Someone who vandalized the Sphinx would be doing something worse than someone who merely vandalized your car. Similarly, some things have cultural or aesthetic value because they're objects of great beauty and perfection. You shouldn't use the Mona Lisa as a napkin, even if your fingers are dirty, because her beauty makes it wrong to treat her like any other piece of cloth. I know that she's not actually painted on cloth, but I couldn't think of a better example. So too, some things have sacred value. You shouldn't use the Bible as a beverage coaster, not because it's not useful, but because it has a kind of sacredness you would be degrading, desecrating, if you treated it like any other object. Context determines meaning, and meaning determines value. The fourth point is that we can extend this line of thought to human beings. Well, artifacts can acquire intrinsic value. Human beings have inherent intrinsic value because the human beings always participate in narratives larger than themselves. Let me mention just two, and there are several others. One source of inherent intrinsic value follows from the social nature of the person. Every person is a familial being because we are descended from parents and capacitated for reproduction. Every person is from and for others. So too, it's precisely through language, which we first receive from our parents, that we are able to be for a community of persons bound by shared ideas, values, experiences, and purposes. In short, we are never mere agents, but always already sons and daughters, spouses and friends, neighbors and citizens sharing a common home. Our embeddedness in these unchosen social relations is the basis of many of our thick ethical concepts, like loyalty and friendship and just generosity, form the starting point of moral reasoning. This from and for notion of relationality, from and for people, also profoundly describes the supernatural origin and destiny of the human person. The human being is the always created site of God's redemptive activity, is from and for relationship with God. Thus, in the Christian tradition, even the bodies of the sickest and most profoundly disabled persons, the bodies of the youngest embryo and the elderly woman with dementia alike, are sacred. It is a Marian form of dignity that humbles the proud and lifts up the lowly. It's not based in status or ability, but gift. The big idea is this: we are embedded in these narratives by virtue of our humanity. Such meaningful frames provide the truth that substantial rationality grasps when thinking about how to treat human beings, just as thinking about the historical, aesthetic, and sacred value of artifacts is relevant to thinking about how we should use them. It is wrong to treat people in ways that are unfitting for our roles in these narratives, even if someone desires this or consents to it, because like Rodney, or the Sphinx, or the Mona Lisa, context, cosmos, determines meaning, and we mean more than ourselves. The Catholic tradition captures these ideas in what we call the doctrine of the sanctity of life, the DSL, which says that because of its sacredness, destructive interventions into the human body should only target disease states and never life itself. The DSL is not what we call vitalism. Nothing in the DSL requires forcing treatments on patients who judge either futile or burdensome. It simply says, "Thou shalt not kill," and call it good or even good medicine. Thus, even though preserving resources, avoiding burdens to your family, and dying with dignity are reasonable ends worth pursuing, suicide and euthanasia are wrong as means to those ends, because they desecrate what God has made good, redeemed by his blood, and called to himself in glory. Now, my fifth and sixth points are reflective. An important insight of 20th century neo-Aristotelian and feminist ethics is that the tradition of Enlightenment liberalism radically underestimated the significance of the body. If, as liberalism often argues, autonomy or agency is the threshold of dignity, then anyone below the threshold of autonomy who can't exercise it, including, historically at least, women and children, the ill and disabled, the elderly, alien, the uneducated, the poor, and of course the unborn, anyone or anything unable to fully or equally participate in society due to the contingent circumstances of their existence lacks dignity. Yet figures as diverse as Martha Nussbaum and Alistair McIntyre have argued human dignity is the dignity of a social animal, and any adequate account of justice must be sensitive to the empirical givens of our shared animal life, especially the normality and the normativity of relationships, disability, dependence, caregiving, and concern. As McIntyre says, we all exist on a scale of dependence and disability. We're never not dependent in some way. So, as many others have argued before me, the case for rational suicide depends not only on the questionable cogency of an impossibly disembedded account of self who participates in no overarching social, cultural, or religious narrative, but also on the questionable agency of a disembodied notion of dignity that reduces to nothing more than the unimpeded operation of the autonomous will. Can only understand disability and dependence as loss, and caregiving and concern as altruistic. Yet, as every parent knows, love is not loss, even when it suffers. And as Augustine once realized, our suffering and neediness are signs that we are made by and for love, both human and divine. We are not enough for ourselves. In other words, if life is sacred, even our suffering is a mark of our dignity, a cross before the crown. Sixth, and finally, let me reiterate the claim that the debate over rational suicide is fundamentally about the meaning of rationality, what Charles Taylor calls social imaginaries. Our existential and political conflicts over secular and sacred narratives is a mark of postmodernity, living as what he calls buffered selves in a disenchanted universe, one in which, like Milton's Satan or Tolkien's Melkor, we've come to regard the idea that we might be part of a narrative that we didn't choose, but is just there, frightening, threatening, and offensive. Taylor reminds us that our fear of meaningfulness is a historically bent, culturally contingent offshoot of Western liberalism and not a neutral default. The theological elephant that I pointed to earlier is there to remind us that secular postmodernity is so often like Polonius, both blind and closed to richer accounts of rationality, meaning, and value. So debating rational suicide without paying attention to the historical, cultural, and intellectual context and genealogy in which that issue arises would be superficial. So allow me to use my final minutes to make two practical points. So I suspect that both Professor Davis and I are wary of what Ivan Illich called medical nemesis, this legal industrial juggernaut that uses our collective fear of disease, disability, and death to trap us in bureaucratically managed engineered hells called hospitals in the final years of our lives. The euphemism death with dignity be understood against that background of industrial medicine. We all want to live and die peacefully with agency, integrity, independence, and self-determination. But AP2 warned us that modernity worships death, that we've created what Pope Francis has called a throwaway culture that solves social problems with violence. People try to solve problems like dementia, poverty, pregnancy, physical and mental illness, violence, because they feel trapped by bad options that don't address the values they perceive to be threatened. A seamless culture of life would have us address social issues with social solutions, not with more killing. Remember, the phrase, "you leave me no choice," is almost always inaccurate. We can make dementia-specific advanced directives appropriate, effective, and most importantly, enforceable. We can make compassionate and affordable dementia care a solution of first resort, as we find in Dutch and German dementia villages, which focus on dignified quality of life rather than acute care and life extension. There are alternatives to killing. And my final practical point is this: the pluralistic and liberal culture such as ours, we need to think very carefully about choice architecture, nudges, and perverse incentives. As we currently see in Canada, the easy efficiency of a suicide and euthanasia regime encourages patients, doctors, governments, and even families to evaluate people on the basis of their utility. Now, rich and determined people will always be able to find opportunities to end their lives as they wish. But suicide and euthanasia-focused regimes typically fail to prevent poor, vulnerable, and desperate people from feeling forced into suicide because they see no other way out of their difficulties. Expose in the New Atlantis just 2 weeks ago showed that Canada is considering euthanizing people because they're homeless, lonely, or mentally ill, and they feel trapped. Defaults matter. It matters whether our first response to these people is a death-dealing syringe or life-affirming support. Death, or this kind of death, it's like pickle in a chicken sandwich, flavors the whole thing, right? So the social structure of the suicide and euthanasia regime, the social structure it offers in support of individual autonomy, is the same structure that pushes those who most need our help and want to live towards state-sponsored death. If one of the fundamental criteria of social justice is the impact of a policy on the most vulnerable people in society, then a permissive suicide and euthanasia regime is manifestly unjust. Who cries fast when his son asks for food, hands him a steak? Thanks.
Yeah.
Give the mic first.
cuts. Yeah. Oh. So I'd be really crazy to try and get into a theological argument with you, and I won't. You're probably right. People who start with your premises may well arrive at your conclusions. Let me say two things. One sort of practical and the other more policy. So practical one. So I actually can't remember right now. How long has it been since Oregon first had its so-called death with dignity? 30 years, maybe? Something like that. And you can go online and look, take you 5 minutes. And one of the things that Oregon and all the 12 or so states followed it, put in their laws was a very strong recording requirement. You can go and you can see who in Oregon and the other states has used their physician suicide laws, and you will find that they are almost exclusively white people with decent health insurance who are not poor. Now, some people will say, well, wait a minute, then why are we spending all our time on something that, is only for the privileged? And that's maybe a fair argument. But the idea that, we've been using these to kick poor people under the carpet, the facts in the US just don't support that. Secondly, on a more policy question. So there's a philosopher I don't know if you've encountered, named Eva Kittay, K-I-T-T-A-Y. Eva and I have something in common. I was sort of moved to this area of thought by having a mother who died a very long death with dementia. Eva had a daughter who was born, I forget why, but in any case, profoundly intellectually disabled at a level of 6 months or less, and has always been that, and has lived quite a long life. And that profoundly changed Eva's way of thinking. So Eva's very concerned that whatever happens in our society does not threaten the life of her daughter, Seisha, who does not have much utility in the usual sense of the word and takes enormous resources, but is not miserable as far as we can tell, not physically in distress. So Eva's very concerned about that, and I share that concern about autonomy and my control over my body. Seems to me one of the really hard questions that we have to think about is how do we argue for a world in which both those things can coexist? How can a world that allows me to define my value, my way, which yes is very much about cognition, without devaluing Seisha? Now, Seisha, I know what her values are because she never got to the point where she could have values, but seems like living a continued life is in her best interest, given that it seems to be not unpleasant. So I would argue differently if Seisha had lived a long life and written an advance directive and was now in this state, but that's not the case. So how do we argue? I don't think it's logically, but in terms of the real world, how do we have a world in which people like me get back on our values without threatening continued social support for people like Seisha? I think that's one of the really important questions. But now we want to hear your questions. So I think we should hang out together. Just in time.
I'm very interested in the reactions of adults, children, and spouses of those who have been. I would imagine, and if that's your experience, Dr. Davis, is there a reason particular reason above others that convinces them to agree with the decision?
Yeah, so the question has to do with the adult children of people who decide to end their lives because of impending dementia. I don't have figures, so I can't really give a good answer to your question. Again, this is just, anecdotal, but families tend to share values. In my family, my son was already an adult when my mother began to become demented in her late 80s. And he and I went through that experience with each other and with her. And he and I are like this, right? If, we were the only person, I wouldn't worry. And it's in large part, we're very different religiously. He's a Buddhist. But we both adored. And, he knows exactly what I want. He reads my stuff. And, there's just no daylight between us. So that's just one example. There are times when I was a fellow at the Cleveland Clinic, for example, doing bedside clinical ethics. Sometimes what you get are family members. I remember a man with ALS who decided to refuse a feeding tube, which I think you would not object to. And his brother was very, very upset. And the ethics committee, was trying to deal with this. And what we realized was the brother kept saying, I can't let my brother starve to death, because the brother was taking it as his responsibility. And we said, look, your brother is an adult who made this decision. The man could be at peace with it. So sometimes I think family members mistake where the agency really is, or they're worried that they're going to feel guilty or something. Great question. Hey, I don't bite and I'll never see you again. So just.
I have a question then, but I'm going to encourage questions, all right? I want to hear a little bit about nudges and protector of choice. So Dr. Ray, well, especially for you, Dena.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Ray says, let's say that dying for people with dementia is as it is now in Canada. People might be for that choice. So the right to die to something more like die. I mean, especially I'm thinking of our how we do healthcare, right? So maybe there's a cap on how much they choose to buy these drugs, for example. So I'm just wondering.
That's yes. The question was, what about the various nudges that can impel people in one direction or another? And what if it's cheaper and easier to nudge people toward choosing death? I think it's a fair question, but it's a fair question in both directions, right? What about the nudges? What about people who say, oh, if you commit suicide, everybody will think that your son neglected you or whatever it might be. I mean, there are nudges in lots of directions, but it's interesting to me that when Oregon was debating, and if I remember this right, they had to pass the referendum twice, right? They passed it and then something, I don't know, they had a very long debate and a lot of voting and a lot of discussion and a lot of people, including feminist liberals like Susan Wolf, for example, were very worried that women, for example, would be nudged to not want to take resources, to put their families before them. But again, if you look at the data in places like Oregon and Washington, I think, frankly, the data in Canada are politicized on both sides. So I don't really know what they are, and I think it's going to be a while. We're talking months here. I think it's going to be a while before that shakes out. But where we do have data, it just didn't work that way. It wasn't more women than men, and it wasn't poorer people, and it certainly wasn't African Americans, who tend to be less interested in things like hospice anyway. So I'm not terribly worried about that.
Sure. So United States has, with some of those conditions on who can qualify for physician-assisted suicide in many states, we have some fairly rigorous review processes. And the things that I think we're seeing have broken down in places like Canada, but not necessarily in other places like Switzerland, right? So I think we have quite diverse sets of data from different places that have tried to put physician-assisted suicide into place. So, I think there's a huge cultural aspect to what those incentives not just look like. Ross Douthat has made an interesting argument, however, that when we're looking at the case for physician-assisted suicide, one of the things we have to watch out for is a progression in the kinds of arguments that are used to justify that position. So we oftentimes begin with the very conservative kind of case, which says that only say people who are terminally ill, of irremovable suffering, who have maybe 6 months to live, maybe they can qualify because there's a strong case for passion in those sorts of cases to relieve their suffering through death. And that's what gets physician-assisted suicide sort of on the table. But as things progress, we might move to something more like a libertarian position, which privileges autonomy and says, well, those sorts of decisions are best made between individuals and their doctors, and the government should have much of a role in limiting who can ask for assisted suicide or not. So maybe someone with a mental illness that's gone untreated, or maybe, for example, this homeless man in Canada who's made the news, who thinks that his chronic homelessness is irremediable. It's causing him lots of issues. And so he's applied for physician-assisted suicide. So maybe we wouldn't apply in the same circumstances. Maybe we would want to make a libertarian argument that, well, maybe that's a good enough reason for him, and maybe it's not the government's business to get involved. So it's a bit more of a permissive argument. But then perhaps we move to something more like the Roman conception of suicide, in which suicide is understood to be a noble action, precisely because it does either avoid certain kinds of indignities, or it avoids burdens to your family members and so on. And so you move to something more like a duty to commit suicide in certain sorts of circumstances. And whether or not you support each of those arguments, I think one of the things we have to think about when we're talking about choice architecture is precisely how people will understand and interpret the institution of physician-assisted suicide as it becomes institutionalized in a culture. Will people understand that because this is available, that only people who are selfish or superstitious or stupid don't choose it, and instead they see themselves as feeling pressured so that they don't place a burden upon their family, right? So whether that's real or whether that's merely perceived, I think those sorts of things can be something that function very much like nudges in healthcare.
By the way, just quickly, I might have rather sloppily said that, but I'm not necessarily a proponent of physician-assisted suicide for at least two reasons. One, there may be reasons, and a lot of my doctor friends seem to think so, why this is not a good idea for the profession of medicine. That's number one. Number two, there's a great new book by an anthropologist named Mara Bookbinder called Scripting Death. And she looks at what happened in Vermont after they passed, I think in 2013, a Oregon type law. All the laws are more or less the same. And, they passed it in Vermont by the legislature, which is different than other states. So, presumably Vermont's a pretty democratic small d place. Presumably perhaps the people in Vermont thought this was a good idea, but it's almost impossible to actually do it because physicians don't want to get involved, either because they don't believe in it, or because of stigma, or because the health networks they work with won't let them. So there are all kinds of reasons why I'm not sure that physicians necessarily ought to be our gateway. We might have death doulas, death midwives, or I mean, there's no practical reason really why we have to have physicians involved in this. Physicians are the people who would diagnose. Yeah, you've got impending Alzheimer's and not a UTI or something, but that's a fairly neutral kind of job that relies on their expertise. Do we take a question from the Zoom? Okay.
Actually, I was going to ask about medicalization. And I mean, the earliest argument for rational suicide had no mention of medicine. And I wonder if you could both comment a little bit on how medicalization is part of the architecture of choice in this matter.
Well, I mean,
largely.
I think it kind of works both ways, right? On the one hand, there's the concern. The question has to do with medicalization, architecture of choice. Do people understand architecture of choice, the term? I mean, here's an example from the great book, Nudge. You're walking into a cafeteria, you're a 7th grader, into a cafeteria. There's cream pie and for dessert, but also fruit salad. Is the cream pie at your eye level and the fruit salad up above? Or so that's literally architecture in a physical sense. Or is it easier to reach the fruit salad? That's architecture of choice, right? Someone has to decide where to put those. The argument is, hey, you can still get the cream pie. No one's stopping you. But the fruit salad at eye level is what you're being nudged toward. So that's the argument there. I think it's the concern, that's been articulated that, it will be easy for doctors to say, well, there are 4 things you can do, and here's one of them, right? And then maybe someone who thought that suicide was a taboo might think, oh, this is really a possibility. And that would be okay with me anyway. But then there's the concern that maybe that's put first, right? Or, if I were in your shoes, this is what I would do. And then, that would be extremely, I think unfortunate and problematic. I'm not sure, frankly, where I'm not enough of maybe an economist to know where those nudges really are, because there's a heck of a lot of unnecessary medicine in this country, right? We think maybe about a third. So it's not like people are always trying to save money and do things the simple way. So where those nudges are is not totally clear to me.
But isn't the enabling legislation for medically assisted suicide is itself an architecture of choice?
Yeah, but on the other,
enabled choice.
On the other hand, the notion that we didn't need legislation, I don't need legislation to get antibiotic or, let's put abortion away for a moment. But lots of things I do with my doc, I don't need legislation for, right? She might give me an antidepressant. She doesn't need legislation, right? So the very fact that we needed legislation was because it was already an architecture of choice against it, right? To my students, do all of you know that suicide is not illegal, that it's perfectly legal in every state? The question is assisting it, whether that's legal. I have a hard time convincing my students. They say, well, wait a minute, suicide's got to be illegal. No, it's not. It was decriminalized a long time ago. But so those also are, nudges, right?
You mentioned medicalization. I think that's a big issue that is worth talking about. So those of you who don't know, medicalization is the idea that more and more of what we might have previously taken to be just a normal part of the human condition, whether it's whether it's some kind of inconvenience, or whether it's a chronic illness, or whether it's old age and disability, that more and more of those are no longer seen as problems for perhaps a community to solve, but rather become the kinds of things that we think we ought to be treating with various drugs, devices, interventions, and so on. And one of those things is something like dementia. So when we're talking about what it means to have a nudge in the direction of medicalization, and maybe you can speak more about this, one of the ways in which we are encouraged to care for people who have dementia is through our industrialized health system, through hospitals and nursing homes and dementia memory care centers, these sorts of things, in which, if you ever been in one of these, they can be fairly depressing places, especially over COVID. I mean, people are in locked rooms so that they don't wander out of the facility into the street and get lost. Visiting hours can be quite limited. People are dressed oftentimes in hospital-style clothes, or they're in shared rooms with strangers and sorts of things. But that is a economically efficient way to house people who require some fairly intense kinds of care. And one of the things that I wanted to suggest is that that is a cultural choice that we're making. There are other places in the world that deal with people who are suffering from dementia in quite different ways. There was a wonderful article back in 2014 in the Atlantic Monthly called "Village Where Everyone Has Dementia," where they talk about these dementia villages in places like the Netherlands. There's some in Germany, I think some in Belgium, in which they have created essentially, instead of a building with rooms for people, they've built small little towns on, say, 4 acres. When I say towns, I mean they have houses, they have a movie theater, they have a grocery store, they have a restaurant, and the residents, instead of patients, they're residents, they live together in houses grouped with other people who come from similar lifestyle backgrounds. So there's like a Christian house, there was a I call it a bougie house. There's a, homey house, I think they call one of them, and so on. So people are put together with other people who have shared similar lifestyles and values in the past. They don't do that in Germany, by the way. They find that fairly offensive. They're also less successful, as I understand them. There's been some research on that. But these residents wear normal everyday clothes. They live in houses where each of them has a private room and then shared common spaces, much like a suite in college. There are no locks on the doors. They're cared for by a full-time staff of nurses and physicians who help them out with their activities of daily living. But these residents get to do things like go shop for food, help clean up around the house, do some gardening in the backyard, as much as they're able and interested in doing these things. And the focus there is on improving their quality of life as much as possible, as long as possible, and not on acute care for medical problems. And you can also add to these sorts of things dementia-specific sorts of advanced directives. And when we say dementia-specific, I think Dartmouth has one of these, where you can specify what kind of care you would like at different stages of dementia, mild, moderate, and severe. And you can talk about what kind of medical care you would like at each of those stages, whether you would like, what kind of nutrition you would like at each of those stages, and where you would like to be cared for. One of the boxes you can check is, I never want to go to a hospital when I have this level of dementia. I want to be cared for as much as I can in my home, and if I require more acute care, that's when I would like to receive hospice care if I'm living or whatever. So again, the point is, when we're talking about medicalization, we have a tendency in the United States to throw technology at problems, when sometimes there are other ways that are more socially friendly to deal with those same problems, that are cost competitive with the kinds of things that we do in the United States. And we don't tend to make those choices. And that's, I think, a cultural issue.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the same one. I spent a lovely day in the Netherlands a year ago at a village. I can't think what the English would have been, but garden was part of it anyway. Yeah, if I had dementia and couldn't end my life, that would be choice 2. But it would be choice 2. And I think I'd love to, I don't know how practical it is, but sure, I would love to see everybody across the world have that choice. I'd love to see a world in which people with dementia did not overwhelmingly rely on their daughters rather than their sons. I mean, this is a huge feminist issue. It's women who lose their jobs to care for their parents or in-laws. It's women who then don't have the Social Security when, to retire on. It's a very feminist issue. So I'd love to see all of that solved. But even so, there would be people, and I'm one of them, who would just want to end her life before that became necessary. But, you know, us autonomy freaks are all about choice. So the more choice, the better. I think.
Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks on Zoom as well. I know challenges, but I'm going to trust the audio was at least good enough. Good night.